Jack Morrison stood on Martha Henderson's front porch for a full minute before knocking, his hand frozen halfway to the door. Through the window, he could see warm light and hear the sound of women's voices and laughter. He had spent the entire drive from his ranch rehearsing what he would say to Elena Rodriguez, but now that he was actually here, his mind was completely blank. He had changed clothes 3 times that morning, settling finally on his newest jeans, a white button-down shirt, and the leather jacket his grandmother had given him for his 21st birthday. He had even gotten a haircut yesterday, something he usually did only for weddings and funerals. The whole situation felt surreal, like he was preparing for a job interview that would determine the rest of his life. Martha opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been watching for him. She was wearing an apron covered in flour and a smile that seemed to take up her entire face. "Jack, honey, right on time. Come in, come in. Elena's in the kitchen helping me with breakfast." Jack stepped into the warm house and was immediately surrounded by the smells of his childhood: bacon frying, fresh coffee brewing, and the pine scent of Martha's Christmas tree. The familiar smells calmed his nerves slightly, but his heart was still pounding as Martha led him toward the kitchen. Elena Rodriguez was standing at the stove, turning strips of bacon with a fork while talking to Martha about something that had made them both laugh. She was smaller than Jack had expected, probably no more than 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and the kind of natural beauty that didn't need makeup to be striking. When she turned to greet him, Jack was surprised by the warmth in her brown eyes and the genuine smile on her face. "You must be Jack," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Elena. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this whole situation must seem pretty strange." Jack shook her hand, noticing that despite her professional appearance, her grip was firm and her hands showed small calluses that suggested she wasn't afraid of physical work. "Nice to meet you, Elena. And yeah, this is definitely the strangest thing I've ever done. But then, again, this has been a year for firsts." Martha bustled around them, setting plates on the small kitchen table and pouring coffee into mismatched mugs that Jack recognized from his childhood visits to this house. Sit, both of you. We have all morning to talk, and the food is getting cold." The first few minutes of breakfast were awkward, with all 3 of them being overly polite and making small talk about the weather and Elena's drive from Denver. Jack found himself studying Elena when he thought she wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the successful financial consultant Martha had described with the woman sitting across from him eating bacon and eggs like a normal person. Finally, Elena set down her fork and looked directly at him. "Jack, can we just address the elephant in the room? We're both here because we're considering a business arrangement that happens to involve marriage. I think we'll both feel better if we can talk about it honestly instead of dancing around the subject." Jack felt a surge of relief. Elena's directness reminded him of his grandmother, who had never believed in wasting time on social niceties when there was real business to discuss. "You're right. Martha probably told you about my situation with the bank. I'm about to lose everything my family built, and I'm running out of options. She told me some of it, but I'd like to hear it from you. If we're going to be partners, I need to understand exactly what I'm getting into." Elena's tone was professional but kind, the voice of someone who was used to dealing with financial crises but still cared about the people involved. Jack spent the next hour telling Elena about the ranch's history, the recent string of bad luck, and his failed attempts to solve the problems on his own. He was surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. She asked intelligent questions, took notes on a small pad she pulled from her purse, and never once made him feel like a failure for being in his current situation. When he finished, Elena was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. Then, she looked up at him with an expression that was part sympathetic, part calculating. "Jack, from a business perspective, your situation is actually quite salvageable. You have valuable assets, good fundamentals, and what sounds like a temporary cash flow problem caused by circumstances beyond your control. The right investor could turn this around fairly quickly. And you think you're that investor?" Jack asked. "I think I could be, with the right partnership." Elena leaned back in her chair and seemed to choose her words carefully. "But before we talk about money, I need you to understand why I'm considering this arrangement. It's not charity, and it's not some romantic fantasy about playing at being a rancher's wife. Elena told him about her career, her success, and her growing dissatisfaction with the corporate world. She explained how she had been looking for a way to invest her money in something meaningful, something that would preserve rather than destroy traditional ways of life. Jack found himself impressed by her honesty about her motivations and her realistic assessment of what ranch life would entail. "I'm not naive about how hard this would be," Elena said. "I've spent the last 3 weeks researching everything I could find about ranch operations. I know it's physically demanding, financially uncertain, and requires skills I don't currently have. But I'm willing to learn, and I think my business background could be an asset if we do this right." Martha, who had been quietly clearing the breakfast dishes, suddenly spoke up. "Why don't you two take a drive over to Jack's place? Elena should see what she's considering investing in. And, Jack, you should show her around yourself rather than having her hear about it secondhand." The drive to Jack's ranch gave them a chance to continue their conversation without Martha's well-meaning but obvious matchmaking efforts. Elena asked about the land, the cattle operation, and Jack's plans for the future. Jack found himself opening up more than he had expected, telling her about his dreams of breeding high-quality horses and maybe developing some of the land for sustainable tourism. "You've really thought this through," Elena said as they turned into the ranch's long driveway. "These aren't the plans of someone who's just trying to hang on to the past. You're thinking about how to adapt and grow." Jack felt a flush of pride. Most people, including the bankers, had treated him like he was fighting a lost cause. Elena was the first person who had recognized that his plans were actually practical and forward-thinking. "My grandmother always said that tradition was important, but not if it meant being too stubborn to change when change was needed." When they reached the house, Jack suddenly saw his family's property through Elena's eyes. The peeling paint, the broken fence posts, the general air of decay that had been creeping in as he ran out of money for maintenance. He had been so focused on the big financial picture that he had stopped seeing the smaller problems that were making everything look worse than it was. "I know it looks pretty rough right now," Jack said as they got out of the truck. "I've been putting off everything that wasn't absolutely essential just to keep the lights on." Elena walked slowly around the house, looking at the structure with the same professional assessment she had applied to the financial numbers. "The bones are solid," she said finally. "Good foundation, good roof line, quality materials. This is just cosmetic stuff that can be fixed with time and money." They spent the next 2 hours touring the property. Elena asked detailed questions about water rights, soil quality, and market access. She took pictures of the barn, the fencing, and the views of the mountains. Jack found himself seeing his own land differently, recognizing its potential rather than just its problems. When they reached the high pasture that overlooked the entire valley, Elena stopped walking and stood quietly for several minutes, taking in the view. The Rocky Mountains rose majestically in the distance, their snow-covered peaks gleaming in the afternoon sun. The ranch land spread out below them in rolling hills covered with winter grass and stands of aspen trees that would be spectacular when they turned gold in the fall. "Jack," Elena said finally, "this is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. I can understand why your family fought to keep it. My grandmother used to say that some places choose you instead of the other way around," Jack replied. "She always believed this land chose our family to take care of it." Elena turned to look at him, and Jack saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. The professional consultant had been replaced by someone who was genuinely moved by what she was seeing. "I think I'm beginning to understand what she meant." They drove back to the house as the sun was starting to set, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold. Elena was quieter on the return trip, and Jack wondered if seeing the ranch's problems up close had changed her mind about the whole arrangement. "Jack," Elena said as they pulled up to the house, "I want to be completely honest with you about something. When I first heard Martha's proposal, I thought of it purely as a business investment, a way to use my money for something meaningful while getting myself out of a career that was making me miserable." Jack felt his heart sink. This sounded like the beginning of a polite rejection. "And now I realize this isn't just about money or business plans. This place, this way of life, it's something special, something worth preserving not just for financial reasons, but because the world needs places like this. People like you who understand that some things are more important than profit margins." Elena paused and looked directly at him. If we do this, if we enter into this partnership, I want you to know that I'll be completely committed. Not just financially, but personally. I won't be some silent investor who writes checks and stays out of the way. I'll be your full partner in every sense of the word. Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized was there. Elena, I have to ask, aren't you worried about the personal side of this arrangement? I mean, we're talking about marriage, sharing a house, building a life together. What if we can't make that part work? Elena smiled for the first time since they had started their serious conversation. Jack, I've been thinking about that since I got here. We're both adults who have been disappointed by traditional relationships. Maybe a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals has a better chance of working than one based on romantic feelings that might not last. They sat in the truck for a few more minutes, watching the last light fade from the sky and the first stars appear above the mountains. Finally, Jack spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. Elena Rodriguez, would you consider marrying me for purely practical reasons and helping me save my family's ranch? Elena laughed, a sound that was part nervous, part delighted. Jack Morrison, I thought you'd never ask. Yes, I'll marry you for purely practical reasons. When do you want to have the wedding? How about New Year's Day? Jack suggested. That way we can start the new year as business partners and see what happens from there. Elena extended her hand for another handshake. Partners, she agreed. As they shook hands in the gathering darkness, both Jack and Elena knew they were taking the biggest risk of their lives. But sometimes the biggest risks led to the most rewarding outcomes, and sometimes the most unconventional arrangements turned into the most successful partnerships. 3 days later, Jack deposited Elena's check and made his payment to the bank. The relief of being financially secure for the first time in months was almost overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the excitement he felt about the future. Elena had returned to Denver to wrap up her affairs and prepare for the move to the ranch, but they talked every evening, making plans and getting to know each other as people rather than just potential business partners. On Christmas Eve, Jack stood on his front porch and looked out over the land that would soon be their land. The house was still cold and the paint was still peeling, but everything felt different now. For the first time in months, he could see a future that didn't involve losing everything his family had built. Elena called that evening with news that made the future even brighter. She had been analyzing the ranch's books and had discovered that Jack qualified for several agricultural grants and tax credits that he hadn't known about. Combined with her investment and some modest loans they could easily afford, they would have enough money not just to save the ranch, but to implement all of Jack's plans for expansion and modernization. Jack, Elena said, her voice crackling through the phone connection, I think we're going to make a very good team. Happy Christmas, partner. Happy Christmas, Elena, Jack replied. I can't wait to see what next year brings. As Jack hung up the phone and prepared for his last Christmas as a bachelor, he thought about his grandmother's ring, still waiting in the trunk at the foot of his bed. It might not be the romantic love story she had envisioned when she gave it to him, but it was a love story of a different kind. A love for the land, for tradition, for building something lasting and meaningful. Sometimes the best Christmas gifts came disguised as the most unexpected opportunities. And sometimes the most practical arrangements turned into the most extraordinary adventures. Elena Rodriguez gripped the steering wheel of her silver SUV tighter as she navigated the winding mountain road toward Pine Ridge, Colorado. The GPS on her dashboard showed she was still 30 minutes away from Martha's house, but already the landscape had changed dramatically from the urban sprawl of Denver to something that looked like a Christmas card come to life. Snow-covered pine trees lined the road on both sides, their branches heavy with fresh powder that had fallen the night before. The Rocky Mountains rose majestically in the distance, their peaks touching a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Elena had lived in Colorado her entire life, but she rarely ventured outside the Denver metro area. She had forgotten how breathtaking the mountains could be when you got away from the city. Her hands were trembling slightly, and not from the cold. In all her 32 years, Elena had never done anything as impulsive or potentially foolish as what she was about to do. Meet a complete stranger with the possibility of marrying him for business reasons. It sounded insane when she thought about it like that, but somehow, When Martha had first suggested it 3 weeks ago, it had made perfect sense. Elena's phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system, and she saw her assistant's name on the display. "Hi, Rebecca. Please tell me there isn't another crisis that needs my immediate attention." "Actually, things are surprisingly quiet here," Rebecca said. "Mr. Chin's merger is moving forward smoothly, and the Peterson account restructuring is ahead of schedule. I think you can actually relax and enjoy your vacation." Elena smiled despite her nerves. Rebecca was the only person at her firm who knew the real reason she was taking time off during the busy year-end period. Everyone else thought she was just taking a well-deserved break after 5 years of working every holiday season. "Thanks, Rebecca. I'll check in after Christmas, but unless something is literally on fire, don't call me." "Deal." "But, Elena," Rebecca's voice became more serious. "Are you sure about this whole thing? I mean, I know you're tired of the corporate world, but marrying a stranger seems like a pretty extreme career change." Elena had been asking herself the same question for weeks. "I'm not sure about anything, Rebecca, but I'm sure that I can't keep living the way I have been. 80-hour weeks, sleeping in the office, having relationships that fail because I never have time for them. I'm successful on paper, but I'm miserable in reality. And you think marrying a broke rancher is going to make you happy? I think helping someone save something meaningful might make me feel like my life has purpose for the first time in years," Elena said. "And if it doesn't work out, at least I'll have tried something different." After hanging up, Elena thought about the conversation that had changed everything. She had been visiting Martha for Thanksgiving, as she had every year since her parents died in a plane crash 8 years ago. Martha was her father's sister, the only family she had left, and their holiday visits were precious to both of them. This year, though, Martha had seemed distracted during dinner. Finally, over dessert, she had told Elena about her neighbor Jack Morrison and the financial troubles threatening his family's ranch. Martha had painted a picture of a hard-working, honest man who was about to lose everything through no fault of his own. The drought, the early winter, the economic downturn. It was a perfect storm of circumstances that would have defeated anyone. But it was when Martha mentioned Jack's determination to save his family's legacy that Elena had felt something stir inside her. She had spent her career helping large corporations maximize their profits, often at the expense of smaller businesses and individual families. The idea of using her financial expertise to save something that actually mattered, something with history and heart, was incredibly appealing. The marriage proposal had come later that evening, when Elena had been asking more questions about Jack and the ranch. Martha had been characteristically direct about it. "You need a purpose, and he needs money. You want to get out of the corporate world, and he needs someone who understands business. You're both lonely, and you're both tired of the lives you're living. It could work, Elena. It could really work." Elena had initially laughed it off as one of Martha's eccentric ideas, but over the following weeks, she found herself thinking about it more and more. She had looked up everything she could find about ranch operations, land values in Colorado, and agricultural business models. The more she researched, the more intrigued she became. With proper funding and modern management techniques, a ranch like Morrison's could be quite profitable. But it wasn't just the business opportunity that attracted her. It was the idea of being part of something real and tangible. Instead of moving numbers around on computer screens to make rich people richer, she could help preserve a way of life that was disappearing from America. She could use her skills to build something rather than just maintain someone else's wealth. The GPS announced that she was approaching her destination, and Elena felt her heart rate increase. She had spoken with Jack exactly once, a brief phone call 3 days ago to arrange the details of her visit. He had sounded polite, but wary, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone who had lived in rural Colorado his entire life. She had tried to imagine what he looked like based on Martha's descriptions: tall, strong from years of physical labor, with brown hair and green eyes. But descriptions could only tell you so much about a person. Martha's house came into view as Elena rounded the last curve before the village of Pine Ridge. It was a charming 2-story home with a red roof and white siding, surrounded by huge pine trees and decorated with Christmas lights that twinkled merrily in the late afternoon sunshine. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Elena could see warm light glowing in the windows. It looked like the kind of place where people actually had time to enjoy the holidays. Martha came out onto the porch before Elena had even turned off the engine. She was wearing a bright red sweater and a huge smile, looking exactly the same as she had at Thanksgiving. Elena got out of the car and was immediately enveloped in one of Martha's famous hugs, the kind that made you feel like you had finally come home after a long journey. Elena, sweetheart, you made good time from Denver. How was the drive? Martha helped her carry her bags up the front steps and into the house, which smelled like cinnamon and pine needles and something delicious baking in the oven. Beautiful and terrifying, Elena said honestly. I kept thinking I was crazy for doing this, but then I'd see another gorgeous vista and remember why I wanted to get out of the city. Martha led her to the guest bedroom, which was decorated in soft blues and whites with a view of the mountains through lace curtains. You're not crazy, honey. You're brave. There's a difference, even though they sometimes feel the same. Elena set down her suitcase and looked around the cozy room. Martha, what if he takes one look at me and decides I'm completely wrong for this? What if I take one look at the ranch and realize I have no idea what I'm getting myself into? Then you'll both have learned something important about yourselves, Martha said practically. But, Elena, I've known Jack Morrison since he was a little boy, and I've known you your whole life. You're both good people who have been dealt some tough breaks lately. Sometimes good people need to help each other out. They went downstairs to the kitchen, where Martha poured 2 cups of hot chocolate and added generous amounts of whipped cream. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm mug and felt some of her tension ease. This house had always been a refuge for her, a place where she could be herself instead of the polished corporate executive she played at work. Tell me more about him, Martha. The real him, not just the things you think I want to hear. Elena settled into the window seat that overlooked the back garden, where bird feeders hung from the pine branches and tiny footprints in the snow showed where rabbits had been foraging. Martha considered the question carefully. Jack is stubborn, which can be both a strength and a weakness. He inherited that ranch when he was 23 and his parents died, and he's been trying to run it exactly the way his father and grandfather did. He's resistant to change, even when change might save him. Elena nodded. This matched what she had expected. People who had been doing things the same way for generations often had trouble adapting to new circumstances. What else? He's proud. Almost too proud. He won't accept charity, and he's been trying to solve his financial problems completely on his own. That's why it took me weeks to convince him to even consider meeting you. He kept saying he didn't want to be anyone's burden. Martha smiled. Of course, he doesn't see that refusing help when it's freely offered can be its own kind of burden on the people who care about you. Elena thought about her own tendency to handle everything alone. She had built her entire career on being independent and self-sufficient, never asking for help even when she desperately needed it. Maybe she and Jack Morrison had more in common than either of them realized. Is he kind? Elena asked. I mean, really kind, not just polite. Oh, honey, yes. He's the kind of man who will drive 2 hours in a snowstorm to help a neighbor with sick livestock. Last spring, when old Mr. Patterson broke his hip, Jack spent 3 weeks working Patterson's land in addition to his own, just to make sure the crops got planted on time. He never asked for anything in return. Elena felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate. Kindness was the one quality she valued above all others. Intelligence could be developed, business skills could be taught, but genuine kindness was something people either had or they didn't. If Jack Morrison was truly kind, then maybe this arrangement could work. When do I get to meet him? Elena asked. Tomorrow morning. I invited him for breakfast, nice and casual. You'll both be nervous, so I figured it would be better to meet here rather than you going to the ranch right away. Martha looked at Elena seriously. Honey, I need you to understand something. That ranch means everything to Jack. It's not just his home or his livelihood, it's his identity. Losing it would break something inside him that might never heal. So if you decide this isn't for you, please be gentle about it. That evening, Elena lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the complete silence of the country night. In Denver, there was always noise, traffic, sirens, neighbors, the hum of electricity, and civilization. Here, the quiet was so profound it seemed to have weight. She could hear her own heartbeat and the the soft whisper of wine through the pine trees outside her window. She thought about her apartment in downtown Denver, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture and view of the city skyline. She had been so proud of that apartment when she first bought it, seeing it as proof of her success. But, lately, it felt more like her expensive prison cell. She came home exhausted every night, ordered takeout, and fell asleep on the couch with her laptop still open, working on reports that would be forgotten within a week. Was she really considering giving up her career, her independence, her entire life, to marry a man she had never met? When she put it like that, it sounded insane. But, when she thought about the alternative, more years of the same meaningless routine, slowly burning out until she became one of those bitter executives who had everything and nothing at the same time, the ranch began to seem like a reasonable risk. Elena had always been good with numbers, and the numbers on Jack Morrison's situation were actually quite encouraging. He owned 5,000 acres of prime land that would be worth millions under different circumstances. He had good water rights, which were becoming increasingly valuable in the drought-prone West. The ranch had been profitable for decades before the recent string of bad luck, which suggested that the fundamentals were sound. More importantly, Elena had savings and investment income that could easily cover the ranch's operating expenses while she and Jack worked to make it profitable again. She had been looking for ways to invest her money in something more meaningful than stocks and bonds. A working ranch that preserved open space and traditional ways of life could be exactly the kind of investment that would give her life purpose. But money and business plans were just the practical side of the equation. The personal side was much more complicated. Elena had been in several serious relationships over the years, but they had all ended the same way. Her career demands had eventually driven away men who wanted more time and attention than she was able to give. The idea of a marriage based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than romantic love was actually appealing. No unrealistic expectations, no promises that couldn't be kept, no heartbreak when reality failed to match the fantasy. Elena finally fell asleep sometime after midnight, and she dreamed of wide open spaces and a man whose face she couldn't quite see, working side by side to build something that would last long after they were both gone. When she woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the lace curtains, and she could hear Martha moving around in the kitchen below, humming a Christmas carol while she prepared breakfast. Elena showered and dressed carefully, choosing jeans and a soft green sweater that Martha had complimented in the past. She wanted to look approachable but not too eager, attractive but not like she was trying too hard. She applied just enough makeup to look polished and then stared at herself in the mirror, wondering if the woman looking back at her was brave or foolish. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted up from the kitchen, and Elena heard the sound of a truck pulling into Martha's driveway. Her heart started beating faster as she realized that Jack Morrison had arrived. In a few minutes, she would meet the man who might become her husband, and they would begin to figure out whether Martha's crazy plan had any chance of working. Elena took a deep breath, smoothed her hair one last time, and headed downstairs to meet her potential future. The snow crunched under Jack Morrison's worn boots as he walked toward the old farmhouse that had been in his family for 3 generations. The December wind cut through his heavy coat like a knife, but it was nothing compared to the cold reality that had been eating at him for months. The Morrison ranch was dying, and Christmas was only 2 weeks away. Jack stopped at the fence post and looked out over the vast expanse of land that stretched toward the Rocky Mountains. 5,000 acres of prime Colorado ranch land that his grandfather had bought with nothing but determination and calloused hands. Now, at 28, Jack was about to lose it all to the bank. The morning sun painted the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and pink, but Jack couldn't appreciate the beauty. All he could see were the empty cattle pens, the broken fence posts he couldn't afford to fix, and the barn that needed a new roof before the next heavy snowfall. The drought last summer had killed most of his crops, and the early winter had forced him to sell his cattle at rock-bottom prices just to keep the lights on. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another call from the bank, no doubt. He let it go to voicemail, just like he had been doing for the past week. He knew what they wanted to tell him. The final notice had arrived 3 days ago, giving him until January 15th to come up with the back payments or lose everything. Jack's breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as he made his way back to the house. The old Victorian structure had been beautiful once, with its wraparound porch and intricate woodwork. His grandmother had painted it pale yellow with white trim, and it had looked like something out of a fairy tale. Now the paint was peeling, several shutters hung crooked, and the front steps creaked ominously with each footstep. Inside, the house was barely warmer than outside. Jack had turned the heat down to save money, wearing layers of clothing instead. The hardwood floors that his grandmother had polished to a shine were now dull and scratched. The furniture was the same pieces his family had used for decades, sturdy but showing their age. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he had made that morning and sat down at the kitchen table with the stack of bills that seemed to grow taller every day. Electric bill, water bill, insurance, feed store charges, equipment repairs. The numbers swam before his eyes, and no matter how many times he added them up, they always came out the same. He was broke. Jack had tried everything he could think of. He had applied for loans at 3 different banks, but his credit was shot from missing payments over the past 6 months. He had put ads in the paper offering his services for odd jobs, but work was scarce in their small mountain community during winter. He had even considered selling some of the land, but the real estate market was terrible, and he would only get a fraction of what it was worth. The sound of tires crunching on gravel interrupted his dark thoughts. Jack looked out the kitchen window and saw a black sedan pulling up the long driveway. His heart sank, thinking it might be someone from the bank, but as the car got closer, he recognized it as belonging to his neighbor, Martha Henderson. Martha was in her 70s, a widow who had lived on the adjacent property for as long as Jack could remember. She had been his grandmother's closest friend, and after both his parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, she had been like a surrogate mother to him. Her late husband had been a successful businessman, and Martha was one of the few people in the area who still had money. Jack opened the front door before Martha could knock. She was a small woman with silver hair, always perfectly styled, and bright blue eyes that seemed to see everything. Today she wore a long wool coat and carried a thermos and a plate covered with a red checkered cloth. "Good morning, Jack," she said, stepping into the house and immediately noticing how cold it was. "I brought you some fresh biscuits and hot chocolate. You look like you could use both." "Thanks, Martha. You didn't have to do that." Jack led her into the kitchen and cleared a space at the table. Martha set down the food and looked around the room with the practiced eye of someone who had been managing households for decades. "Jack, honey, we need to talk." Martha sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. "I know about the bank notices. Word gets around in a small town, and I've been worried sick about you." Jack felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He had tried so hard to keep his financial problems private, but apparently he hadn't been successful. "Martha, I appreciate your concern, but I'll figure something out. I always do." "No, Jack. This time is different, and we both know it." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "You're about to lose everything your family built, and there's no shame in accepting help from people who care about you." Jack started to protest, but Martha held up her hand. "Before you say anything, let me tell you about an idea I've been thinking about for weeks. It's unconventional, and you might think I'm crazy, but hear me out." Martha opened her purse and pulled out a photograph. It showed a young woman with dark hair and warm brown eyes, standing in front of what looked like a modern office building. She was attractive in an understated way, wearing a simple business suit and smiling slightly at the camera. "This is my niece, Elena Rodriguez. She's 32 years old, lives in Denver, and works as a financial consultant for large corporations. She's brilliant with numbers and has helped more businesses get back on their feet than I can count." Martha paused and looked directly at Jack. "She's also single, and she's looking for a change in her life." Jack stared at the photograph, confused about where this conversation was heading. "Martha, I don't understand what you're getting at." "Elena has money, Jack. A lot of money. She made some very smart investments when she was younger, and she's been looking for a way to use her wealth for something meaningful. She's tired of the city, tired of corporate life, and she's always dreamed of living in the country." Martha leaned forward, her eyes intense. I've been talking to her about you for months. I've told her about the ranch, about how hard you work, about what a good man you are. She's interested, Jack. Very interested. Jack set down his coffee cup so hard that it clattered against the saucer. Martha, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Because if you are, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I'm suggesting a marriage of convenience, Jack. A business arrangement that could solve both of your problems. Martha's voice was steady and matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. Elena gets the country life she wants and a chance to use her financial skills for something she believes in. You get the money you need to save the ranch and a partner who can help you turn it into something profitable again. Jack stood up and began pacing around the small kitchen. You want me to marry a complete stranger for money? Martha, that's not marriage. That's some kind of business deal. Exactly. Martha smiled as if Jack had finally understood an important point. It would be a business deal, at least at first. No pressure, no expectations beyond what you both agree to. You would each have your own space in this big house, your own lives. Think of it as a very close business partnership. Jack stopped pacing and leaned against the kitchen counter. And what if we can't stand each other? What if this Elena person takes one look at this place and runs screaming back to Denver? What if I'm not the kind of person she was expecting? That's why she wants to come here for Christmas, Martha said. She wants to meet you, see the ranch, and get a feel for what life would be like here. If either one of you decides it won't work, she goes back to Denver, and we never speak of this again. But if you both think it could work. Martha pulled an envelope from her purse and set it on the table. She asked me to give you this. It's a cashier's check for $50,000, just as a gesture of good faith. If you decide to meet with her, you can use it to catch up on your most urgent bills. If you decide against the whole idea, you keep the money anyway. She considers it a Christmas gift to someone who's had a rough year. Jack stared at the envelope as if it contained a dangerous animal. $50,000 would cover his back payments to the bank and give him enough breathing room to get through the winter. But accepting it would mean considering Martha's insane proposal. She's driving up from Denver on December 22nd, Martha continued. She'll stay at my house for Christmas week. You can meet her, spend some time together, and see what you think. No pressure, no commitments beyond being polite to a visitor. Jack picked up the photograph again and studied Elena's face. She looked intelligent and kind, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had been through her own share of difficulties. Why would someone like this want to marry a broke rancher she's never met? Because she's smart enough to recognize a good investment when she sees one, Martha said. And because she's lonely, Jack. She works 80 hours a week in a job she hates, has no family except me, and no close friends because she never has time for relationships. She wants what you have here, a connection to the land, a simpler way of life, a chance to build something meaningful. Martha stood up and put on her coat. Think about it, Jack. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The worst that could happen is you spend a few days with a nice woman and end up with enough money to save your family's legacy. The best that could happen is you find a partner who can help you build the ranch into something bigger and better than it ever was. After Martha left, Jack sat alone in the cold kitchen, staring at the envelope and the photograph. The rational part of his mind told him that Martha's proposal was ridiculous. People didn't marry strangers for business reasons, especially not in the modern world. It was something out of a historical romance novel, not real life. But the desperate part of his mind, the part that had been growing stronger every day as the bills piled up and the bank notices became more threatening, whispered that maybe Martha was right. Maybe this was his only chance to save everything his family had worked for. Maybe it was worth the risk. Jack opened the envelope and stared at the cashier's check. $50,000, made out to him personally. More money than he had seen in months, just sitting there waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He thought about his grandmother, who had loved this ranch more than anything in the world. She had always told him that sometimes the best opportunities came disguised as the scariest risks. The phone rang, and this time Jack answered it. It was the bank manager, calling to remind him about his payment deadline. Jack listened to the man's polite but firm words about foreclosure procedures and asset liquidation, and felt something inside him harden into resolve. Mr. Patterson, Jack interrupted. I'll have your money by the end of the week. All of it, plus interest. There was a surprised silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Morrison, that would be wonderful if true, but you'll forgive me if I need to see the money before I believe it." "You'll see it," Jack said, and hung up the phone. He looked at the photograph again. Elena Rodriguez, a stranger who might be his salvation or the biggest mistake of his life. Either way, he was going to find out. Jack walked to his bedroom and opened the old trunk at the foot of his bed. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was his grandmother's engagement ring. It was a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing fancy or expensive, but it had been worn with love for over 50 years. His grandmother had made him promise to give it to the right woman someday, when he found someone who would love the ranch as much as she had. He held the ring up to the window, watching the diamond catch the winter sunlight. In 2 days, a woman he had never met would arrive to consider becoming his wife for money. It wasn't the romantic story his grandmother had probably envisioned when she made him promise to find love, but it might be the only story that would save everything she had loved. Jack put the ring back in the trunk and went to find his good clothes. He had a lot to do before Christmas, and apparently, he had a bride to meet.